But what I mean, so what are the because like I look at the Gaffneys and the Harrises is that they are in many respects part of the same animal. I'm not saying they're coordinating with each other or in any way affiliated, but from a sort of from looking at like the structure in society, some are working sort of the more inside game, the more policy game, and then others function to provide almost like a foaming the runway, or maybe foaming the runway for sort of the intellectual acceptance of this. I mean, have we seen? Has there been a project like that, specifically the let's work on this aspect? I mean, it's one thing to say, sort of like brute in terms of brute proclamations associating Islam with terrorism, and we do that by saying, we can have a Muslim ban, we can have extensive spying on people who are in Islamic youth groups in college or whatnot. But has there been a project like this where we're going to really sort of appeal this level of like a soft Islamophobia that we're going to sort of dress up as an intellectual exercise? I mean, because you talk about anti-blackness in the relationship with Islamophobia, and we've had in the past intellectual movements to describe why whites are why white supremacy is actually intellectually justified, not just morally or in terms of God. I mean, is this a phenomenon we've seen before in terms of Islam?
I think so, but it's obviously catching steam, and I think the fact that it's so popular now, and also I think a mode of thinking that is not only exclusive to the right, but is that definitely pervading the center and also the left, is because there's political will and sort of power behind these quasi-intellectuals disseminating these negative ideas or even flat ideas of Islam and of Muslims. And that connection is really important. I think the work of, I would never, try to understate at least the influence of a Sam Harris or a Maajid Nawaz. These are individuals who are, selling books, New York Times bestsellers, filling stadiums. They have millions of followers on Twitter. So their message is definitely effective and is resonant. And the large reason why it's effective and resonant is because they have a president like Donald Trump and movements within Washington, D.C. That repackage their messages in ways that are palatable to lay voters, right? So what Trump says in signing the executive order known as the Muslim ban is not, it's sort of a translated sort of version of what Sam Harris and Maajid Nawaz sort of peddle off as being real academic work. So the connection between what they're doing is really, really important and really potent in terms of, having real effect in the political sphere. Has it happened before? Not to this extent. I think that Islamophobia and Orientalism is more profuse today for a range of reasons. I think part of it is tied to, we can talk about the sort of inverse of white supremacy taking place today with this new moment of white anxiety, or some people even call it white paranoia, because of shifting demographics. So the landscape is really ripe for Islamophobia in both message and policy to be very resonant because of demographic shifts, because of a new sort of racial justice and racial consciousness awakening on the left. And I think third and most importantly, and I'm not sure if you want to discuss this more closely, but this rise in sort of identity politics that is taking place on the far right and the far left, where there's I would say, dangerous fixation on identity in ways that facilitate the rise of forms of bigotry like Islamophobia, anti-black racism, white supremacy, and anti-Semitism in ways that we hadn't seen in a really long time.
Yeah, I do want to get into that. That sounds fascinating. I want to get into that, but I want to make sure that I'm clear in terms of the idea that rising white anxiety it's almost as if there's less latitude for us to express anti-black sentiments in the context of or or racist sentiments. So we're gonna sort of we're gonna whitewash it or launder it through an anti-Muslim sentiment because that's a choice that people are making, or we're talking about now a bad idea, not we're not being so essentialist. Is that the theory there? Is that what you mean by that?
I think that's part of the theory. I think what Sam Harris and Najib Nawaz like to say is like, look, Islamophobia, and they don't even call it Islamophobia. They dismiss the entire sort of framing.
Right. They don't think the word means anything. Right.
Exactly. They think that anti-Muslim animus is a rational form of discrimination based on the threat that is being posed by Islam and by Muslims. So they would not analogize Islamophobia and anti-black racism. I think if you sat down with Sam Harris and Najib Nawaz, they'd say, look, racism against black folks is wrong. They would also say that being anti-Semitic is entirely wrong. These are individuals who you'd have to sort of, if you were to kind of classify them along the political spectrum, they'd probably be a lot closer to the left than the right on most issues.
Right.
But they think that discrimination against Muslims is rational and also serves the best interests of the state. So they view it as entirely distinct from these other forms of bigotry.
Right, and that's not, there's a lot of bigots, I think, who probably feel that way about their own bigotry, right? Like, it's a perfectly rational thing. I mean, God did not mean us to commingle, and but okay, so talk about this theory that you have about identity politics. I mean, it's clear to me that identity politics on the far right, I mean, translates into a certain amount of white supremacy, right? And so that's a pretty straightforward roadmap to being anti-Muslim. How does it function on the left, in your opinion?
Well, there's a range of sort of perils that also exist on the left, and I'll name two of them for the sake of brevity. Number one, the idea, and we saw this, manifested in the exchange between Harris and Juan Cole. So Harris and Nawaz both critiqued Juan Cole for not being an expert, even though he has a PhD in Islamic studies and studied in Cairo at Azhar. Can boast a resume that few have with regard to study of Islam, entirely based on him being a white male. So him being a white male excludes him from being able to speak on these issues. And this is a view that's pervasive on the left, to be frank with you. I think many far left activists and, even pundits have very sadly sort of conflated expertise with identity, and in some respects supplanted the importance of expertise with this fixation on identity. There's a brilliant piece by fellow law professor Nancy Leong called Racial Capitalism, which does a great job sort of, meticulously analyzing this phenomenon. So the danger with that sort of position, and representation is important, and I'm a critical race theorist, and I can tell you how important representation is, but there's been a disposing of expertise for the sake of racial optics in bringing in somebody to speak on issues just because they look the part, if that makes any sense. Yes.
I mean, and I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's not to say that, that's not to say that, that's not the same argument as just because I'm a white guy doesn't mean I can't have an opinion on this. It's to say that expertise counts.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's it. I mean, if somebody like Juan Cole, who's a white male but has been studying Islamic studies for his entire life, and in the sort of like upper 1 percentile of these issues, his opinion does not only count, but it should be seriously considered and heard.
Right. So there's
we shouldn't
right. So there's a certain amount of you get a certain amount of credibility for having a lived experience. But expertise still has a huge import in these things.
Yeah, no, lived experience matters considerably, right? But so does training, so does expertise. And again, you and I are both American, right? Being American does not make us, experts on the First Amendment, does not make us experts on, American administrative law. doesn't make us an expert on a whole host of issues. So identity might be sort of a segue into knowing about a specific subject matter, but expertise should be considered to be the most salient sort of metric of knowledge.
It is sort of fascinating to me that identity politics is, I mean, we see it wielded obviously by white supremacists, right? I mean, that's a fairly obvious calculation.
Yeah.
But to see it leveraged by someone like Sam Harris, as he did in that exchange, and we see this all the time. I'm not... You guys are caught up in identity politics. You're so worried. I mean, in a political field, you're so caught up in this idea of identity politics. But look, here, I have a black friend. And so,
of course, yeah.
I mean, that type of dynamic is sort of, it's fascinating to sort of see how much it's being utilized as, in many respects, a justification for some type of either discriminatory actions or beliefs.
No, definitely. And I think for me, somebody who thinks about these issues really closely, I think the most unfortunate sort of development in the political discourse is there's really no more nuance, right? There's no more sort of, careful criticism. And look, we can carefully critique specific segments of the broader Muslim global milieu that is dangerous, that is vile, and that should be considered, an element that we have to confront, whether it's the Saudi regime, whether it's terror networks, whether it's specific interpretations of Islamic doctrine that is problematic. That is true, but that is only a sliver of the broader population. The reality that we have in this discourse right now is people are talking in terms of hyperbole. People are flattening entire experiences. And people are discussing entire groups as monoliths. And the sad reality is that it's not only happening at the sort of bottom of the political discourse, the individuals that are sort of being wielded out as our thinkers of the day and our, most influential pundits are also engaging in that, very flat and, vapid sort of conversation as well.
And it's not just simply a question of the quantity, even in the context of something like Saudi Arabia. We're talking about the interplay of Islam with a whole host of historical and economic contextual issues and power dynamics. And it's really, to examine that stuff is really to examine how these various factors, interrelate with each other and play off each other.
Exactly. I think that we definitely see that with the present sort of discussion on Islam globally speaking. We see domestically with the way Islamophobia is framed. I would just, somebody who wrote this book, I think what I'm trying to do with this book specifically is to counter what people like Sam Harris, Gaffney are doing on the Islamophobia side, and bring some care, bring some, again, some careful analysis to what's going on in a way to hopefully bring some thoughtfulness back to the conversation, if that's not an impossible sort of objective.
Well, I think it's, I guess hope springs eternal, right? But lastly, let me ask you that. I mean, that's the, to some extent, the private realm. What is the opportunities for structural change?
Well, the opportunities for structural change, I think, hinge considerably on what happens politically, right? So if we get let's say, a Democratic administration succeed this one, the Sanders administration specifically, which I think is the most robust in countering Islamophobia, we could see doing away with the executive order known as the Muslim ban, with a subsequent executive order that quashes it or does away with it. So that's, one imminent hope that I have that, again, hinges on this next presidential election. Also, the shape of the courts, right? The Supreme Court is one that upheld the Muslim ban largely because it's now been packed with originalist or conservative justices brought in by the Trump administration. So, another objective in the short term is to sort of cultivate a court that is more, I would say, keen on delivering the promise of the First Amendment, specifically free exercise of religion and Establishment Clause, that enables sort of a structural dismantling or at least diminishing of Islamophobia.
Khaled Beydoun, author of American Islamophobia, Understanding the Roots and Rise of Fear. Thanks so much for your time today. We will put a link to your book at majority.fm. Real pleasure talking to you.
No, thanks so much. I really appreciate the conversation.
Bye-bye.